You all for coming. I wish it were cooler. I wish it were better lighted. I wish the carpet didn't look like a barn. But then again, this is a public institution, and we're lucky we have any lights at all. And probably within a couple months we won't. And then we'll meet in the dark. But that would be symbolically appropriate given what I'm about to say anyway. This is the greatest crisis of capitalism in my lifetime. And given the way you all look and given my white hair, that means it's the greatest crisis of capitalism in your lifetime too. And it therefore requires an extraordinary effort to understand it and an even more extraordinary effort to come up with a program to deal with it. What I'm going to do is try to explain to you how I see this crisis and how it arose, where it comes from, and then to offer a socialist response to it. And this is not because of my abstract interest. I am one. That's why I'm interested in doing this. I want to develop a socialist response to it. I just don't want to do it in the realm of theory. I want to do it in actuality. And the best way I know how to do that is to use the most highly developed theory for doing such things, which is Marxist theory. So that's what you're going to get, a Marxist analysis of what happened and what might be done. So let me begin, as is necessary in these sorts of things, by saying what I think this crisis is not. It is not, for example, a financial crisis. It strikes me as outrageous, as an attempt to limit the scope, the causes, and the implications of this thing as if it were only one sector, finance. That strikes me as the equivalent of thinking that a serious pain somewhere in your body should not be investigated as to whether or not it has something to do with the system of your bodily functions that happens to show up here or there. It's an attempt to make the symptom where it blows up be the localized place beyond which it hasn't spread. You might hope it hasn't spread, but simply asserting it and assuming it could be deadly. And I think it's deadly in this case. I also don't think this has much to do with executive pay, which has been outrageous for at least 25 years in this country. It doesn't have to do with greed. You probably have figured out already that greed predates this crisis. Consequently, these are efforts in my mind to keep us away from the central issue, which is to raise the question, is this a crisis of the system as a whole, rather than a problem with this or that aspect of the crisis? The media are virtually at one in keeping it limited. That's, after all, the job of the media in our culture, to calm us, to relax us, to give us human interest stories instead of the news. And so I don't want to do that. And so I want it to be understood that my approach is to say this is a crisis that affects all the parts of this system, manufacturing, services, finance, to be sure, included, but in no way restricted. It didn't start with finance. It's not ending with finance. I want to put it back in the context from which I think it was ripped. In order to do that, and always because I'm conscious, being an economics professor, that I have colleagues in the room, or even if they're not in the room, they'll hear about it. It's always necessary for us to do something on the board to demonstrate kind of our bona fides, that we can do things on the board. So I'm going to do that, and I'm going to tell the story as best I can of how we got into this mess here in the United States. And I'm going to divide this little graph into two parts. One part goes from 1820 to around 1970, 150 years, during which the productivity of American workers went up each year. The line goes up simply to say that the average worker produced more stuff every year than they did the year before. They were trained better, they had better machines, they had more machines, so the productivity per worker went up every year. Okay. For this period of time, I'm going to draw a second line. And that second line represents what happened to workers' wages in the United States. It's really remarkable that the wages of American workers rose from 1820 to the 1970s. Every decade, they were higher than the decade before. Real wages. Real wages means the amount of money you get as against the prices you have to pay for the things you use your money for. And the profits went something like that too. In other words, productivity went up, and in the sense of economics, the workers shared that productivity rise by rising wages, and the corporations enjoyed rising profits. Okay? And that's very peculiar. There may not be any other capitalist country that had 150 years of that experience. It certainly gave the American working class the idea, and you'll see the relevance of this in a couple minutes, gave the working class the idea that the United States was really special. Here's a place where year after year you do better. Your children will do better than you did, and your grandchildren will do still better, and there's something awfully special. Some people called it the exceptional America. And, you know, being Americans, the major explanation for this required looking up. He likes us better than he likes other people, something that's been reaffirmed, as you know, many times. George Bush said it too. Sarah Palin said it the other night, so it's well known. And there are other arguments given. You know, we have virgin land, you know, untouched land, as long as you forget the people who were touching it before, things like that. Nonetheless, there is this hard, powerful reality that the American working class enjoyed 150 years of rising consumption. It's therefore not surprising that a working class that enjoys rising consumption for 150 years would choose to define its own self-worth, measure its own success in life according to the standard of consumption. That's safe. That's going up. Safe thing to measure yourself in. So Americans began to think of themselves as successful if they lived in the right neighborhood, drove the right car, wore the right outfit, had the right vacation in the right part of Europe, etc. Americans became wedded to consumption in a way that other working classes in the world hadn't, probably still haven't. It's not an accident that in the United States, the industry we call advertising rose first and developed further than anywhere else. A whole industry devoted to cultivating the passion for consumption in a population already 3/4 of the way there. Why is this important? It's important because in 1970, the world changed for the American working class in ways I don't think it has come to terms with at all. Here's what happened. The middle line, the real wages, stopped going up. They go like this, sort of, tending down a little bit. The real weekly wage, the real hourly wage of a worker in the late 1970s was higher than it is today. What you get for an hour of work in the way of goods and services is less now than your parents got before you. Real wages stopped. Productivity kept going up. And if you understand what will happen, it doesn't take any kind of advanced degree. I'm not against your getting an advanced degree. It takes a long time. And these days it won't do much beyond taking a long time. But you don't need it. You don't need it. If what you get from each worker keeps going up, but what you give each worker doesn't, then the difference between what each worker produces and what you pay him or her gets bigger and bigger and bigger. This difference here gets bigger and bigger and bigger. The difference between what you get from each worker and what you pay him becomes unbelievable. The last 30 years, roughly since 1970-75, has been an unbelievable time in America. And it begins with the leveling out of wages. 150-year history is over. And the American people are beginning slowly to sense that the consumption joy is finished. Let's look at why that happened. In the 1970s, a number of factors came together to make that possible. First, the recovery of the defeated World War II competitors, Europe, Japan, meant that American businesses faced competition. And competition from people who had developed their economies after the war with the idea that the only way to succeed was to beat the Americans who dominated everything from 1945 to 75. So if you're going to make it, you have to produce what America produces better or cheaper or best of all, both. And so we all drive Japanese cars. Summary, right? Or if we don't do that, we drive European cars. Perfect example, though that was the major industry in the United States, automobiles, and they went to work to replace us, and they've succeeded. So Americans' businesses reacted in part by leaving the United States, looking to find cheap places of producing somewhere else. That meant Americans lost their job, and so they began to work for less money. The wages start going down. Second, if American company couldn't find cheap labor abroad, there was the alternative. Bring the cheap labor here. And we explode our immigration to bring desperately poor people here to lower the wages. We have a women's liberation movement that takes thousands, millions of American women who worked in the house and they look for a job. You get the picture. A whole lot of factors came together, and I haven't exhausted them all, to make wages go down in the United States. Stagnate or go down. Productivity keeps going up. We know that it goes up because the last 30 years are the implantation of the computer, making it possible for each worker with benefit of computer to do much more than they could have done without one. Productivity rises, wages are flat. The difference is what the employer gets. The last 30 years have been a fantasy, as you're going to see, of employers' dreams come true. An unbelievable time in which the wages stay flat, but each year that you're paying the worker the same, you get more and more stuff to sell. Employers' profits go wild, and all the people who get their fingers on employers' profits, the professionals who sing the songs they like to hear, the shareholders who get a piece of the action of each company's profits, they're the ones who have a bonanza in the last 30 years. Fantastic time. The only thing more profitable than simply making the money off the worker whose wages are flat while he produces more are all the people who handle this exploding bundle of profits, who package it and repackage it and finance it and lend it and borrow it and invent new mechanisms. That's called the finance industry. Of course they went crazy. Every finance company, every bank, new kinds of banks, all kinds of banks, stumble all over themselves to get a hold of this. This immense pot of profits also made everybody else who could get their hands on it grab it before it disappeared. Executive salaries went nuts in the United States in the last 30 years. I understand from many Americans they've only discovered this fact in the last 30 days and are outraged by it, but it's 30 years old. It means the population was sleeping. Or maybe it just didn't matter. So long as you were getting your situation, who cares if they got 30, 60, 70, 80, 100, 200 million? What difference does it make? There's so much profit that we can all be at the trough. Capitalism always goes wild. We always have bubbles and booms under these circumstances. We open a new continent for capitalism, it goes crazy. It has a new invention, it goes crazy. The railroads did it, the electricity did it, nuclear energy did it. Whenever there's an opportunity like this, for whatever reason, capitalist competition produces a bubble that bursts. If you don't want a bubble that bursts, you got a problem with a system, because it has done it over and over again. What did the working class do? I'm more interested in that, being a socialist. What did the working class in America do? It had a problem. What was the problem? No rising wages. For a population committed to measuring each person's success by the amount of consumption they could afford. Measuring your meaningfulness in life, your standing, your prestige. Everything about you is measured in terms of consumption. What car, what neighborhood, what mall, etc. What happens to a population for 150 years that experiences rising consumption when the means they had always had to achieve it, rising wages, stop? Well, they can go through a trauma right then and there. We can't anymore. It's over. Most people don't do that. They found other ways, and two in particular I want to draw to your attention because of their effects. One, Americans undertook more work. That is, people took a second or a third job. The number of hours per year worked by the average worker has risen about 20% since the 1970s. By comparison, in Germany, France, and Italy, for example, the number of hours worked per year per worker has dropped 20%. That's a stunning difference. American workers began to work to a level of exhaustion. Secondly, they sent more family members out to work. Women particularly went out to work. Retirees went back to work, and teenagers learned to love a job sooner than they had before. We got more people working. Did that solve the problem of American workers' rising consumption? No, because it turned out that there were all kinds of costs associated to the fundamental exhaustion of the American worker and her family. The woman who goes out to work needs an outfit. In our society, she probably needs another car. The children who come back to work have all kinds of, who go out to work have all kinds of needs that they discover out there in the world of work. And the family begins to fall apart in America. And that causes all kinds of other expenses. Daycare expenses, psychotherapy expenses, attempts to cope. We consume more drugs, legal and illegal, than any other population in the world. We have the highest rate of divorce. These are all signs of a household that is blowing apart. And so the costs neutralize the income. So it couldn't solve the problem of rising consumption. So they had to do the second great thing. The American working class began and went on the greatest binge of borrowing in the history of any working class in any country at any time, period. Stunning. And this created, for those who had made the profit, an even greater opportunity than flat wages had given them. The business community began to realize that they had a double whammy here going, a fantastic double opportunity. They could get the profits from flat wages and rising productivity, and then they could turn to the working class traumatized by an inability to have more consumption and make available to them the means for consuming more when you can't earn the money to pay for it. You borrow it. And so the profit earners lent the money to the workers to enable the workers to consume more, not by paying them rising wages, the previous 150 years, but by lending to them. Now try to think of yourself as an employer. Some of you are hoping, I'm sure, to get to that point, some point in your life. Here's a chance to jump forward and enjoy it beforehand, especially if you don't get there. You are now, let's get it from the employer point of view, you are now going to, instead of paying your worker a wage, you're going to lend him or her the money so that they have to pay it back to you with interest. Now there is something to be proud of as an American. You live in a system that makes you distraught about your consumption and then services your trauma by lending you money. They get you twice. They stop paying you wages and they substitute a loan for a wage. And you know, the American working class was a great borrower. The richest working class on earth. The American working class had accumulated collateral. It's the best thing your lender could want. Americans own their own homes. So you could lend to them in a way that no other working class could ever borrow, because they had no collateral. The American working class was the richest working class you could have chose to lend to. This is a real bonanza, a whole new continent of making money. Lend to the worker. So that the financial enterprises, reeling from the profit of rising productivity with flat wages, got even more excited, if it's possible, by the unending vistas of lending money to a working class. And they did. And it solved the problems. For a while, they could pay workers less and less, flat. And instead of that making the usual problem for capitalism, you know, capitalism's contradictions are legendary. Even if the legend is a little rusty for many of you, it's legendary, right? Every capitalist has an incentive to push the wages down. The collectivity of capitalists then complains, because if the wages have been successfully pushed down by each one, then the workers don't have enough to buy the crap. Oh, gee, well, we got to give them more wages so they can buy the crap. Yeah, but if we give them more wages, the profits go down, and then we don't want to play anymore. So this is a problem. This is a problem, but don't worry about it. All of that works out. Capitalism is an engine of efficiency, profitability, prosperity, and economic growth. We all know that. So in this system, we produced magic. Workers who could consume ever more, profit that was falling out of every house, every category. It really was fantastic for 20 years. The mid-'80s to now was fantastic. Every problem seemed solved. Underneath the beauty, workers who were completely exhausted, whose family life was so disastrous that the Republican politicians who pushed all of this could stay in power by positioning themselves as the champions of those families that had fallen apart because of what the Republicans did. But the Republicans were the ones who wanted to bring you back to the little old town and the nice church and happy mommy. They were the ones to protect you against the consequences of what they had done. That's a smart political move. That's right. That's really brilliant. You make the changes that collapse the family and present yourself as the champion of the good old family that's falling apart, and you point at the Democrats as the ones who somehow bear the responsibility. It's a genius of Republican politics. But we have an exhausted working class, can't work anymore, and we now have an anxiety-ridden working class because their debts are unsustainable. Unsustainable. The combination of advertising and all this history made people borrow who couldn't pay it back. That could have been foreseen. It's nothing new. And with you put together the desperation of the American working class given that history, and the efforts of the finance industry to scrounge out every conceivable borrower, the idea that you would lend money to people who couldn't pay it back, that's not a tough call. But the system was premised that that wouldn't happen. And so when it did, nobody was prepared. The banks who had financed it, the clever new instruments, whether they were derivatives or mortgage-backed securities or collateralized debt obligations or credit default swaps or any of the mechanisms that were invented, they all depended in the end on the ability of these endless loans to be repaid, and of course that didn't happen. But it didn't happen because banks were crooked. Were they crooked? Of course they were. They're always crooked. It's only a question of degree, and in this Wild West scenario, they were a bit more crooked than usual. When the banks made their loans, they got credit ratings. Some of you know about this. A AAA rating, Moody's, Standard & Poor's, Fitch's, the three big companies. So the banks went to them and said, we'd like you to do an objective study of this security and then give it a AAA rating, which they all complied. They did. And so they were able to market it to people who thought it was secure when it wasn't. That's not new. These people have all been around the block. That's a typical problem. Nothing... The discovery by the press that there's been corruption in the air is crazy. This was a system built to fail, to reach its end when the combination of exhaustion physically and emotional anxiety from the debt made people unable to continue. And those people are now, by the millions, walking away from those obligations, and the house of cards comes down. Part two. That's part one. Part two. What do you do about this situation as it implodes around us? I don't know what the market is today, but at 2:30 when I walked into my last class, I got a telephone call that the stock market was down another 300 points, so I don't know. Still? Okay. So the big bounce that was expected for today was exactly as robust as all the other predictions about what would happen after all the other little bailouts before this last big one. What is going to happen? Well, there are three kinds of ways of dealing with this, and I'll stop with that. One is conservative, one is the liberal, at least what we call liberal in this society, and one is a socialist alternative I'd like to present for you to think about. The conservatives these days are in a tough spot. It's hard for them, and I want to be honest with you, I'm enjoying it immensely. I do. I don't want to pretend otherwise. The story of how markets and private enterprise interact in such a way as to produce wonderful outcomes is, even for them these days, a cause for gagging. But of course, ever resourceful, there are always conservatives who will rise to the occasion, and some of them are rising now, sort of like dead fish, and they are reaching the conclusion that the reason this all happened is because of governmental intervention in the free market. If only the government hadn't done, and then they rattle off 20 things that the government did over the last 20 years, which indeed it did, and then they try to draw a line between those things the government did and this disaster now, to reach the conclusion that the reason we have this problem is too much government intervention. That's as predictable as arguing that sometime over the next 2 months there will be rain, and then claiming, having made this proposal, that on next 2 days from now, when it rains, it's because you understood the mechanism. So that's what conservatives will do. And that's what they are doing. But these days, they get almost nowhere with this. Even the mainstream press has a hard time with this sort of stuff. That's why people like us are in the press suddenly in America. What about the other, the liberal left? This is much more interesting to me and much more important, and is where I want to focus my attention. Liberals, social democrats, leftists, progressives, a lot of words, they seem to be in favor of regulation. They seem to find the problem that the banks weren't regulated, that these credit rating companies weren't regulated, that the Federal Reserve didn't regulate better or differently or more or something. Regulation. Regulation. Paul Krugman wants regulation. My colleagues in this department, not all, heaven forbid, not all, but a good number of them want regulation. Liberal commentators want regulation. Leftists I talk to want regulation. The salaries should be regulated not to be so high. And the greed should be regulated. All kinds of things should be regulated. I find this astonishing. Not even astonishing, depressing. And let me tell you why. In the 1930s, the last time we had a capitalism hitting the fan in this way, we produced a lot of regulation. Social Security didn't exist before then. Unemployment insurance didn't exist before then. Mass government hiring of people to do things didn't exist before then, etc. So we had a lot of regulation. Banks were told you can do this, but you can't do that. Insurance companies were told you can do that, but you can't do that. Lots of constraints and limits on corporations. All these regulations had a particular quality that I want to focus your attention on. They limited what a board of directors of a corporation could do 10 ways to Sunday. They taxed them. They did all kinds of things that annoyed, bothered, and troubled boards of directors. And you would be no great genius to understand that a board of directors encumbered by all these regulations would have the idea, let's try to evade them. Let's try to undermine them. Let's try to get rid of them. And that they would probably go to work on that project about as soon as the regulation was passed, if not sooner. So it's very interesting that the regulations we had imposed here in the United States by Franklin Roosevelt and all the people who made that happen had an interesting quality. They did not take away from the board of directors the freedom nor the opportunity to undo all the regulations and reforms. These were a set of regulations that left in place an institution with every conceivable incentive to undo and erase the regulations. But that wasn't the worst of it. They also left in place a board of directors who, as the first appropriators of all the profits produced in our system, thereby had the resources with which to realize what the system gave them as incentives. They had the wealth to undo the regulations, because these peculiar regulations left them in that position. It literally invited its own enemies to do their thing. And, although I know it comes as a surprise to some of my liberal friends, the boards of directors, with the incentive to undo the program and the resources to realize their objectives, did so. You and I have lived through the last 30 years in which the boards of directors of the United States' larger corporations used their profits to buy the president and the Congress, to buy the public media, and to wage a systematic campaign from 45 to 75. The basic game was evade them. And after 1975, get rid of them. And it worked. That's why we're here now. After this history, to propose again that we regulate them, leaving them in the same place, my friends, the American working class, I would guess, is going to look at anyone with that idea and with that little curl in the lip say, been there, done that. I'm not going to do that again. I'm not going to wage 2, 4, 6 years of intense struggle like it was in the 1930s to come up with something that has a built-in self-destruct button. It's preposterous. It's not going to work. And if you do it, if the liberal left does that, imposes another set of regulations along the lines of Paul Krugman and the others, not only are you going to have the same history, but you're going to have the same history faster. And let me tell you why. Large numbers of workers are not going to go for this. They're not going to be the enthusiasts of this regulation program precisely for the reasons I've just told you. Been there, done that. But worse, the right wing in America, the business community, has spent the last 50 years perfecting every technique there is known to turn the population against regulation as its enemy. And they're going to go right to work doing again what they have now learned to do, and they'll do it better and they'll do it faster. They're experts at it. So to set up another regime of regulation is to set up something that is going to be real easy to knock down. Therefore, what do? I have a proposal to make, as you might have guessed by now. Here's the proposal. Let's regulate by all means. Let's really try to make a reasonable economic system that doesn't allow people the grotesque abuses that I've described to you here, plus the many more that you know about from the newspapers that I don't go over. But let's not have the self-destruct button in it. This time the change has to include the following. The people in every enterprise who do the work of that enterprise will become collectively their own board of directors. For the first time in American history, we will make the people who depend on the survival of those regulations, whose quality of life, whose chances for a future depend on a society not allowing this to happen again, will be in the position of having those resources and making sure that is the profits of their own work. Make sure that those are not utilized by some board of directors elected by and responsible to shareholders doing what we know they'll do because we've seen them do it in the last 50 years. Now let me conclude by packaging what I just said, which might come as a bit of a shock to some of you, in the language that makes it easier for Americans to digest. Okay, here we go. This proposal democratizes the enterprise. That must be good, right? I use democracy. It must be good. It must be. I mean, everybody believes in that, like motherhood and apple pie. It democratizes. In what sense? Well, it says that the people who work in an enterprise, kind of the front line of those who have to live with what it does, where it goes, how it uses its wealth, they should be the people who have influence over the decisions. So let's do it. That's democracy. Maybe we could even extend this argument. We could say that the democracy in our political life, which, leaves a little to be desired, some people call it a formal democracy that isn't real. Maybe the problem has been all along that you can't have a real democracy politically if you don't have a real democracy economically underpinning it. If the workers are not in charge of their own lives 5 days a week, 9 to 5, the basic time of their life, and how much aptitude and how much of an appetite are they going to have to control the political life when they're not too exhausted on a Saturday to go to a meeting? Maybe we need the democracy of economics, not just to prevent regulations from being undone, but also in order to realize the political goals of a democracy. Another way to put this, if workers were to be their own collective board of directors, then a job description would be different. And I thought I'd conclude with an example, one that I use a lot, which I owe to a graduate student named Kenny Levin, who wrote this dissertation for Steve and me. It goes like this, and it's based on many companies in the Silicon Valley in California, that strip between San Francisco and San Jose. Every year, engineers quit their jobs in big companies like Oracle Systems or IBM or those others. They quit their job, and they hate the job. They hate the job because some idiot supervisor tells them what to do. These are software engineers. They have to come to work in a tie and a jacket, which they hate. They have to go and sit in a stuffy office. They don't want to do any of that. They say it stifles their creativity, and above all, it makes them very unhappy. They want to go and live and work differently. So they quit their job. And together with other people who feel the same way, they each carry their little laptop to Harry's garage. Harry's wonderful. Harry's garage. And there they arrive with Bermuda shorts on, with a Hawaiian shirt, with a Frisbee, a dog, and with enough marijuana to get through the day. Okay? And they have a really good time. They like their job. They enjoy their colleagues. Monday through Thursday they work the way they always did, making software programs. On Friday, they don't. They come to work with Frisbee, with dog, lots of dog. But on that Friday, they sit around and they decide what to do with the profits they make, what technology to develop. They function as their own collective board of directors. And what Kenny Levin discovered was, when you talk to these people, because they're talked to, when you write books about these people, and books have been written, these people say, I'm much happier than I've ever been. I'm much more productive than I've ever been. And then they point out with great pride that most of the great breakthroughs in computer technology and telecommunications achieved over the last 50 years have been achieved by firms like that. What kind of firms would that be? Karl Marx called those firms communist, which means that the great breakthroughs of technology of the last 50 years that have been claimed by capitalism, that's a mistake. They were the achievements of communism. They were achievements of people who walked away from their job in a capitalist enterprise and voted with their feet to organize an enterprise completely differently, namely an enterprise in which the workers were their own collective board of directors. So the story I'm describing to you, the proposition I'm making to you, is not only a way to cope with this crisis in such a manner as will not repeat the sad story of regulation that undoes itself. It's also a story of something that workers in America have already been doing. That they're not conscious that it's communist, that's cute. That's a kind of reflection on their education. That these people are not only not communists, but most of these engineers are members of the Republican Party, that's understandable. It's America. They define what they did as, ready? Innovative entrepreneurship. Okay, you could call it a yellow banana. I don't care. What's important here is how they change things. That is, the solution to this problem requires, to conclude, that the socialist proposal not be understood anymore, as it so often is in America, as having something to do with what the government is going to do or not do. That the socialism I'm talking about begins and focuses at the bottom on the kind of radical reorganization of production that's long overdue anyway in our society, simply on the grounds of democracy, but is now a viable opposition, because a movement that said this to the American people as they struggle with their fear and apprehension about where this is going, is a movement that could get a response that would make socialism come out of the margins of our culture and enter the middle. I've been giving this talk for the last 5 weeks in 1,000 places. I've gotten more invitations to do this and more response in the last 5 weeks than in the previous 25 years of my life. Something is going on, and the openness to this kind of political response to a very serious crisis is a sign of possibility and hope that I hope many of you think about. Thank you.